So yeah, today we're going to talk about the 1848 revolutions. Let me get my screen share on here if I can figure out how to do that. Stalling for time. This is what happens when I'm at home. I don't know what I'm doing. All right. So basically, we're looking at we're looking at the revolutions of 1848 today. Let's see. Yeah. No, I don't want that. Can you guys, are you able to see all the slides right now, or just the main, just the front one?
I can see all the slides, but they're small enough I can't read them.
Okay, let's try this again. Let's try this again. Here we go. This will make more sense, hopefully. Sorry about that. It's been a day. It's been a day. All right, so thank you guys. All right, cool. What we're doing today is we're going to do a flyby of the revolutions of 1848. So we talked about the French Revolution. We've talked about the Industrial Revolution. We're in the modern era now. Now, there are, especially on the back of what we talked about last week with ideologies and reactions to modernity, there are certain lessons that people took away from the last period of revolution, specifically the French Revolution, and that those things don't go away. Your book has you talk about the Congress of Vienna, or also the Concert of Europe, where basically there's I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but a coordinated effort on the part of kings around the West to prop up conservatism and say, you know what, let's just pretend the French Revolution never happened. Let's just rewind the clock and go back to a time when kings ran the show again. Let's see if we can put the genie back in the bottle. That is not possible, because once people have had a taste of democracy, once they've had a taste of greater participation in their government, they see this as a good thing. They don't want to go back to being just like helpless subjects of a king. So one of the revolutionary lessons that we take away from the early 1800s was people want to have a say in government. And I'm talking about this as we're just a few weeks away from our own election, where we hope to have a say one way or the other in what happens with our government. And that's a good thing. We want that. We want that participation. So, but at this point, that's not the norm yet. There's also this idea that, these Enlightenment ideals of individual liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of association, these kinds of free press, these liberal ideas, in other words, these, again, like the classical term liberal, not like the American term liberal, but like these classical liberal Enlightenment ideas, these are good things. And conservatives are trying to stamp these out in Europe. We're mostly focused on Europe for the next few weeks, by the way. We're gonna bring the United States into this more and more. But honestly, in 1848, the United States doesn't matter a whole lot in the West. We're a functioning democracy, and that's about it. But the most of what's happening in Western civilization is happening in Europe. They're still the star of the show. For now, and then we start to take over. The idea is we can do better than absolutism, right? This idea that kings make laws, kings don't have to abide by those laws. It's a double standard. Rules for me, or rules for thee, but not for me, kind of thing. We can do better than that in the West. There's this growing idea that, like, hey, the French Revolution helped us see this, that we can do better than absolutist forms of government. Not to mention, during the French Revolution, Like, yeah, some people died, got their heads cut off, whatever. But as a whole, especially after the fact, people look back with rose-tinted glasses. They look back with nostalgia at the French Revolution, and they go, you know, France was doing really well, despite the terror, despite the internal politics. France was kicking butt. They were expanding their territory. They were winning wars. When Napoleon came around, he rewrote the laws of France to make things more fair for some people. You know what? France was actually doing pretty good for a while there because of the revolution. And despite the failures of the French Revolution, these ideas of, you know what, maybe trying out a different form of government can be a good thing. Maybe liberal ideas are actually a good thing. Maybe greater participation in government is a good thing. Those lessons don't go away, right? Like they were suppressed for a while, for about 2 decades, when the French kings came back. And people in Europe, conservatives in Europe, mostly the monarchs and their supporters, tried to pretend that the French Revolution never happened. But people more and more are like, no, it happened. It happened, and there were some good ideas there. We'd like to try those again. So that's some of the intellectual history, like background to what we're talking about today. There's stuff fomenting under the surface, right? There's stuff roiling around. People are unhappy with kings. So there's some early rebellions in the 1820s and 30s that helped set the stage for 1848. 48 was the year of revolutions, like all across Europe. In fact, the United States got a lot of immigrants in 1848 because a lot of people were fleeing their homelands as they were descending into chaos. So some things to help set the stage for that. Some of the earlier rebellions before 1848 helped to kind of prime the pump a little bit. In France, in 1830, and this is what I mean by liberal ideas being suppressed for a couple decades. Really, I guess just 15 years after Napoleon. But there was this thing called the July Revolution. And it was, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but basically the French had a mini revolution where they just replaced one king with another. They replaced the last Bourbon monarch with a king that they actually kind of elected. And his name is Louis Philippe. And he was seen as a liberal reformer. The French were like, you know what? We don't want to go the whole 9 yards with cutting our king's heads off again. That was bad. That didn't go great the first time. Let's just kick out the king, put in a new one, and this guy says he's a liberal and he's going to bring us more freedoms. Hooray! That's the July Revolution. So it's kind of it's a mini revolution that happens in France. Very little bloodshed. It's initially seen as successful, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. In Russia, of all places, in 1825, the Tsar of Russia, who helps defeat Napoleon, Alexander I, he dies. And his successor is a guy named Nicholas I. Now, Alexander was a popular ruler. Nicholas is not so popular. He's a hardcore conservative. He's promised to not bring any changes to Russia. He's going to keep things the same. There's a group of army officers in the Russian army that want a different czar, a different emperor of Russia. And so they try and get I think it's Nicholas's brother installed instead of Nicholas himself. And Nicholas's brother was more open to liberal reforms. So they stage a very short-lived revolt called the Decembrist Revolt. And they try and put another emperor in charge instead of Nicholas. This does not go well. It is crushed. They're not able to get enough army, rank and file troops on their side, and the officers are executed or sent off to Siberia to work in hard labor camps for the rest of their miserable lives. So, but at least it's an attempt. It's an attempt to bring changes and reforms to Russia, even though it doesn't succeed. By the way, and this is just an aside, There's a band called the Decemberists. I don't know if anyone has heard them or heard of them. Folk rock band, really good. You should check it out as soon as you're done with this class. YouTube it, Decemberists. They're amazing. All right. So there's also the Greek War of Independence. This is another kind of revolution to set us up for 1848. The Greek War of Independence is successful. They shake off the chains of Ottoman rule, and they get some help from Western nations in doing so. So Greece becomes an independent country for the first time in centuries. There's other various strikes and protests that happen. Crucially, times of great unrest are usually precipitated by economic pain. When wages are low, when unemployment is high, when food is scarce, when there's a recession or a depression, that's when you see the most political change, because people are like, screw the system, it's not working for me. Let's take to the streets and force some change. And this is exactly what happens in the couple of years before 1848. It's poor harvest, there's a recession in the global economy. It's bad. A lot of people are desperate, and they're eager for change. By this point also, we see organized ideologies. The people we talked about last week, socialism, communism by this point is starting to come into its own. We're just now seeing Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, so it hasn't really caught on a whole lot yet. But we can include communism here with the liberals, the nationalists, the socialists. All these groups are saying, you know what? We can make the world a better place, and we have some answers to modern problems. So they're all agitating for change, forming secret societies or publishing newspapers and stuff like that. So finally, we get to 1848. This is when the dam bursts. This is the year of revolution. It goes crazy town. Like, it's just, well, let's get into it. Things kick off in France, because that's what France does, right? They kick off the show. They are the opening act. Always the first on the forefront of revolution in the West. The French have yet another revolution in 1848. This time it's against their king that they elected. Remember the liberal king, Louis Philippe? Well, it turns out he wasn't so much in favor of changing stuff in France. He kind of likes being king and calling all the shots. He makes promises frequently to people saying, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna allow more participation in government. I'm gonna allow more freedom of speech. Just we're just gonna let things calm down first." He keeps finding excuses to push back, making actual real change. He's also rubbing elbows with the richy riches, the haves, the wealthy landowners and capitalists in France. And people are seeing this, and they feel betrayed. They're like, dude, we gave you the kingdom. Like, we set you up. We thought that you were going to make changes for us, and you reneged on your promise. So that's when things get bad. Paris, or France really in general, but especially Paris, much like the rest of the world, is facing high unemployment and starvation because of high food prices, because of low wages, because of the economic recession that's going on. There's also this really bad moment, called a PR disaster, when the king's advisor addresses a group of liberals, and he goes, if you want to vote, get rich first, and then you can vote, right? Like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, like, if you want to have a say in government, become like me, a wealthy landowner, and then you can have say in government. This becomes a scandal, a massive scandal. One of the king's closest advisors is basically flipping the bird. to the king's subjects. So this brings us to February of 1848. I don't have transitions here for some reason, so awesome. One of the rules in King Louis Philippe's France was that you can't have political associations. Your book, or one of your documents to read for this week is Alexis de Tocqueville. And he says, one of the great things about America, he's a French guy who tours America, and he writes a book about how great America is. And he goes, one of the great things about America is in the Constitution, it guarantees people can form political associations whenever they want. They can get together, they can talk about politics, they can form political parties, they can form special interest groups and lobbying groups. It's a free-for-all in America. You cannot get in trouble for forming a political association. And he's writing that because France, there's no guarantee of that. If you form a political association that's contrary to what the government likes, you could get thrown in jail. So the way that the French got around this is they would hold banquets. Like they would throw like an actual party. And they'd say, we're not getting together to talk about politics. We're getting together to have a smorgasbord. Like, this is a potluck, y'all. It's not a political meeting. It's a potluck. But actually, they would talk about politics. So there's a banquet held in the honor of George Washington in February of 1848. And here, there's a bunch of liberals. They're talking about politics. They're talking about change. The government cracks down on this. And they send troops in, and they disperse the banquet, and they also shoot a few people while they're at it. This kicks off a period of crisis in France in 48. Paris goes into full-scale crazy town. There's a revolt that happens against the government and the National Guard. Louis Philippe hightails it out of France because he thinks he's about to have his head cut off, and he's probably right. So this is just this kind of crazy happenstance thing kicked off the Second French Revolution, and it results in the Second Republic. Hooray! In France, we get a republic again. Wow, it's just like the late 1790s all over again. Time flies. So here we see a lot of the same things. There's a constitution that's drafted by a National Assembly. We're giving the vote back to men. Universal male suffrage comes back, baby. Men can vote again. And also women no, just kidding. Women don't get anything because we're still living in the misogynist West. And I don't know, ladies, I don't know what to tell you, except it takes a really freaking long time for civilization to get its collective head out of its ass and give women the right to do anything. So in the Second French Republic, there's still no right to vote for women. In fact, it takes until around the time of the Great Depression, 100 years, almost 100 years later, well, 80 years later, for women to get the right to vote in France. So there's one of the big things about the Revolution of 48 in the Second Republic is there's this idea, mostly floated by socialists, that, you know, all these people are out of work and it's the government's responsibility, and this is a very socialist idea, it's the government's responsibility to provide aid to people who can't help themselves. For like whatever the reason is, you know, maybe they're just down on their luck, maybe they are injured, like they're a veteran, or they had a workplace accident, they can't work. Maybe they don't, maybe, you know, they don't have, I don't know, childcare, whatever the reason is. So there's this idea that was put in place in the early part of the Second Republic to institute what are called national workshops. And they're these factories, these publicly owned workshops or factories that are sponsored by the government, and they're designed to put unemployed people to work in temp jobs until they can get back on their feet. you can kind of draw, I guess, a squiggly line to modern day unemployment insurance, or what is it? TANF, TANF, TANF. I don't know how you pronounce that. Temporary assistance for needy families. You can kind of draw like the social safety net that we have, however bare bones it is in the United States. This is that idea. Sorry, go ahead.
Wasn't there something similar to that FDR did with, like, I want to say like digging dams or something, but just to get people work?
Yeah, FDR did this during the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was the Tennessee Valley, where it's just like government public works projects designed to build infrastructure and stuff. But the point of it is to get people back to work. Yeah, exactly. Very good. That's a good comparison. So this idea actually fails because it's a socialist idea, but it's not implemented by socialists. It's implemented by a bunch of business people. And they're like, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't turn a profit. Because that's how business people think. And the business people in government shut it down because it was losing money. And, the more lefty people are over here going, yes, that's the point. It's redistributing wealth from the government to needy people. It's not supposed to turn a profit. But nonetheless, this kind of early socialist experiment gets underfunded, and it just kind of collapses. In fact, there are riots that break out when it's announced that the national workshops are being closed. Because people are like, this is a great idea. I finally got a job. And now you're shutting down these things? Like what? And there's riots, and they had to be put down by the National Guard.
Like, shutting it down, was it good? Like, did it create good jobs and stuff?
It was successful for a little bit. Like, it wasn't as successful as people hoped it would be. It did help some people out, but it was just a very poorly planned idea. It was a slow rollout. There weren't enough workshops in place by certain deadline. Like, they had to meet certain criteria, and it was just a slow, badly implemented idea. So it could have gone a lot better if it had been put in the hands of capable administrators, but it wasn't. And so it just kind of withered on the vine. Yeah. Whereas people look at like the TVA or the other, the New Deal ideas put in place by FDR, like we look back on that and we see that as successful because it got us out of the Great Depression. These workshops were given just a couple months to work, and they didn't really on a mass scale. And so the government shut them down. So it's kind of crappy. It's like building half an airplane and being disappointed when it doesn't fly. So we eventually get the election of a new president. This time it's the grandnephew of the first Napoleon. His name is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He's from the Bonaparte family. And he gets elected president of the Second French Republic. History is really weird, you guys. Anyone could have seen this coming a mile away. 3 years later, after being elected president, this Bonaparte guy overthrows the Second Republic, names himself Emperor of France, and creates the Second French Empire, just like his uncle did 50 years before. It's France, man. I don't know what to tell you. They're weird. I don't know. I don't know. I have a buddy living in Paris right now. He's specializing in French history, and I'm like, dude, explain this to me. How does this happen time after time? And he's like, I don't know. That's just what the French like. It's like, you guys like this thing? I don't know. I kind of like stability in government, but that's just me. So Anyway, we get a very short-lived Second French Republic. It falls down, it goes boom, and we get a new French emperor. We'll come back to him in a couple weeks. In the meanwhile, and this is a map that includes both the revolutions that happened before 48 and also the 1848 revolutions. But what France helps do is kick off a kind of pan-revolutionary fervor that occurs around the West. So we see there are uprisings in, oh gosh, in Spain. There's some agitation in Britain. There's a revolution in all throughout Germany. Germany goes crazy, go nuts. In Cologne, Frankfurt, Berlin, Stuttgart, Munich. There's revolutions happening all throughout Germany, Austria, in Italy, like everywhere. It's crazy. Poland. So this is 1848 in a nutshell. I'm going to hit on a few different examples of kind of the biggest revolutions of 48 because it's a mixed bag of success and failure. Hungary. Hungary is looking at France as kind of a role model of what to do when you don't like your government. They have a dynasty that's been in place for centuries called the Habsburgs. And in 1848, there's a poet who kind of mounts the public square in Vienna. And he reads this revolutionary poem to a crowd gathered in the capital of Hungary. No, not Vienna, sorry. It's, it's Budapest. Sorry, Budapest. Sandor Potofi reads aloud this great revolutionary patriotic poem saying we need to take our country back, basically. And out the people go. They go and they seize the presses, the media, the newspapers, and they start printing revolutionary pamphlets. They declare a perhaps premature end to the monarchy in Hungary. But this doesn't last very long. Like they do gain independence for like 5 minutes. And then the Hungarian aristocracy and the Austrian monarchy asks for help from Russia because Russia's really good at putting down revolutions. And Russian troops come in 1848 and they crush the revolution. So nothing really takes off in Hungary, but at least they try. In Austria, neighboring Austria, there's a revolution that's actually kicked off by students, by you guys. I knew you guys were up to no good. It's a student-led revolt, and again, it's in the same vein. They hear of the French stirrings happening in Paris, and they're like, yeah, we're going to do this too. We hate the monarchy. And so students make alliances with working class people, and they take over the capital of Vienna. There's some fighting in the streets between militias and government troops. And before too long, though, the emperor of Austria, Ferdinand I, he gets, before things get too out of hand, he meets with revolutionary delegates and he sits down at the bargaining table and he goes, you know what? Let's come to a compromise about stuff. He agrees to end serfdom, which is the practice of tying peasants to a parcel of land that they can't leave. Like you're born a peasant, you die a peasant on the same plot of land. You have to work for a lord, just like in the old medieval days. That's over now. He agrees to end certain strict measures by the king to do whatever the king wants. He implements constitutional reforms, granting certain freedoms of speech and things like that, limited freedoms, and there's other repressive laws. So there's no overthrow of the government in Austria. It looked like things were getting there, but the emperor cut a deal with the revolutionaries saying, you know what? I'll give you some liberal reforms if you let me keep my head. And they're like, yeah, man, that sounds good. So this is one of those instances where it's a successful revolution in the sense that they got more rights. They didn't get rid of the king, or the emperor rather, but they forced his hand. So you could probably call this a mixed success. In Dungeons and Dragons, it would be rolling a 7 out of 12 or something. I don't know. That was a bad reference. I don't play D&D. I don't know what I'm talking about. So in Prussia, sorry if I made a really bad.
A 7 out of 12 on D&D is not.
I don't know what I'm talking about. I apologize. I retract everything I just said. I'll just stick to history. So, Prussia. It's important to note, now I think I said this before, maybe a couple weeks ago when we talked about French Revolution. There's no such thing as a Germany yet. The area we call Germany today, I mean, people called it Germany back then, but it was more like a bunch of little countries that all spoke German. But there was no unified German nation yet. Prussia is the largest German kingdom, though. Like, they kind of run the show in northern Germany. And Prussia is a very powerful country because they have a very powerful military. The king at the time is dealing with his own revolutionary impulses. He sees what happens in Austria, where the emperor cut a deal with the revolutionaries, and he vows not to take his country down the same path. So there's riots in Berlin. There are, revolutionaries, liberals, and socialists running around. The king of Prussia announces, he goes, you know what? I'm going to nip this in the bud. Revolutionaries, I'm going to be your best friend. I'm going to give you, free of charge, right now, some liberal reforms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Here you go. And people are like, oh, right, cool. Okay, this is working. This is good. Meanwhile, he's just biding time to organize his army. He sends in the troops to Berlin and makes hundreds of arrests of revolutionaries, throws a lot of them in jail, executes the ringleaders, and any protests that are out in the streets of Berlin, he starts firing on them with his troops. This effectively crushes the revolution before it even gets off the ground. He promises, he's like, you know what, I'm a nice guy though, I'm going to give you more liberal reforms later, and he never does, because he's the king, he's got the upper hand, he's got the army behind him. He can do whatever he wants. So in Germany, we see a failure to bring liberal reforms by way of protests. They are crushed by the king. And the king reiterates his stance on this. He's like, I get to call the shots. I'm going to grant you guys, I'm going to give you 2 inches, but you want the whole 9 yards. You can't have it. Sorry. One of the interesting things about this, the German example, though, is despite this failure to reform Prussia and make it, a liberal democracy like people want, in the city of Frankfurt, elsewhere in Germany, there's an assembly of delegates from all the different German kingdoms, and they get together. And they all say, you know what we should do? 1848 is crazy. It's like, that's a time of great change. Here's what we should do. We should make a unified German nation, like one country run by Germans for Germans, hopefully run by a democracy. But they're like, you know what, we should form a united Germany is what we should do. Now this doesn't happen because the different things are crushed by the kings, but you have the first kind of impulse to unify Germany under one flag. And you can see in the picture here, there's the German flag right there, black, red, and yellow, which it is today as Germany is a unified nation today, but people were like, you know, let's get rid of the dozens of national flags in Germany and just have one German flag. This doesn't happen yet, but in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about the unification of Germany because it does happen. And it's not by liberals, it's by Prussia. It's by the Prussian kings. They unified Germany through conquest. And it's a very interesting, it takes a sharp right turn into like, wow, no one really expected this. So we'll come back to that later. All right, I'm almost done. There's a few other notable uprisings that I'm not going to talk about. There's one in Ireland against British rule. Ireland is ruled by the British. In 1848, they're in the middle of their potato famine in Ireland, so things are really bad. That doesn't go anywhere, though. There's no revolution that succeeds. Another part of Germany, Saxony, tries to have like a liberal uprising. It fails. In Italy, different parts of Italy is starting to really become an interesting place because Italy, just like Germany, is like a few different countries in one. There's no unified Italy yet. So there are protests and riots and agitations happening all throughout Italy to not only make Italy a united country, but to make it a democracy. Those fail, but we'll come back to that in a couple of weeks. So by 1850, you know, just a couple of years after all this kicks off, most of the revolts throughout the West they're burnt out. They lose steam or they're crushed by their governments. There just aren't that many that are successful. So why do we remember this at all? Like, who cares about a year where we had a bunch of failed movements? Why do we even talk about it? Well, there's a few, and Russia. Yeah, Russia has escaped revolution, and so does Great Britain, but Britain has a bunch of strikes that happen, and that's about as far as it goes. So why are we even talking about this? Why does it matter if it's all failure? Well, because there are some small successes for liberals in these moments. There's some silver linings they can look to and be like, hey, at least we did this. Austria was a really big one where they're able to force the government's hand and sit down at the negotiating table with the emperor and gain some concessions, some freedoms. Even though the protests were crushed in Prussia, they still got a little bit of what they wanted. So, and in France, like France becomes a republic for a couple of years before they're taken over by another Napoleon. So there's some limited gains. You know, we see male suffrage come back to France and some places, but it's not all what they wanted because the monarchs are still in charge, right? There's still kings and emperors everywhere. The United States remains really the only major democracy in the West. I guess you could throw Great Britain in there because they have parliament. You can kind of include France in there, but whenever they set up a republic, it lasts for about 30 seconds, and then they set up a new emperor. So, but despite this kind of mixed bag, we still see a global. Yeah, I guess we can call it global because there are other things that happen outside Europe. There's at the very least, there's a pan-European or pan-Western revolutionary impulse where it's found out that you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? It's proven that the conservative monarchs of the West really can only keep things tamped down for so long before people want a greater say in their government, before they take to the streets and start saying, you know what, you guys keep breaking the social contract. We can do better than this. You sit down at the table with us or we're going to riot. That's why we talk about 1848, because it shows that you cannot keep people's will suppressed for very long. There's also a clear distinction that starts to occur. And that is the further west you go, the more democratic things tend to be. the more liberal ideas are taking hold. So in Great Britain, there's kind of a democracy. There's a king, but there's also parliament, right? In France, they like to set up republics, even though they're short-lived. They believe in universal male suffrage. If you go even further west across the ocean, you see the United States, which is a functioning democracy. So the further west you go, the more you see these liberal ideas of individualism, greater say in government, freedoms of speech, all that stuff. The further east you... Sorry, go ahead.
I said, so California is just the end all?
Yeah, California is the end result. It's like it's the highest form of evolution. Where no, if there's one thing you can say about California, it is liberal. That is true. Yeah, no, I mean, half joking, half serious. That you're not wrong about that. The further east you go, the more you start to run into conservative governments. You start to run into a lack of individual freedoms. You get the emperors and kings of Germany and Austria and Hungary. Definitely the czars of Russia are kind of the polar opposite of California, in Russia, where the emperors control absolutely everything. So there's this, you can basically, whether you're walking east or west, you can basically predict how much individual liberal freedoms people enjoy. And that's something that continues kind of to this day, really. Hungary is becoming less and less, Hungary is turning into a dictatorship as we speak, like right now. Russia is still a dictatorship under Putin. Poland has a democracy, but it's becoming less democratic in the last 5 years. It's become much less democratic. So you can kind of, there are these deep-seated ideologies or predictabilities in these cultures in the West that some places are just more resistant to change. Some places are just more resistant to allowing individual freedom at the expense of government control. We'll see if that holds true, over the long term. History is being made as we speak, really. But this is something that's very helpful that comes from the 1848 period. We can kind of see this pattern emerge. All right. Well, that's what I've got. Thank you guys for being patient and listening to my lecture. Are there any questions, anything you guys want to add or talk about?
I just thought about this earlier, and I was kind of curious. Do you know if when they had the banquet to tribute George Washington, if that was like symbolic at all?
Sorry, TJ, what was the question? The banquet of George Washington, what about it?
Was it like symbolic as far as like revolutionary?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was very intentional that, they were like,
yeah,
let's think of like a great democratic hero to honor. And we're not getting together to talk about politics. We're having a banquet. But it was a very like intentional, George Washington is our hero in France kind of thing. And that
I was just going to say, I am pulling out to go get my COVID test, so I'm going to have to leave.
Oh, shoot. All right. Well, best of luck with that, TJ. I hope you're well. Hope it goes well.
I feel pretty a cough, but I still have to get tested.
Yeah.
But
all right.
See you Friday.
Yep. See you Friday. Yeah, I'm done, guys. Yeah. Thanks for everything. You've been a great audience. Let me know if you have any questions about this week's readings. De Tocqueville is kind of hard to get through, but we'll talk about him on Friday. I think it'll be fine. All right. I'll see you guys. Have a great week.